Welcome to a special edition of the Share Life podcast. We're in an ongoing series as part of the discovery process for my next book project, From the Garden to the Cross, How Jesus' Harrowing Mission Shows Us the Way Forward. In this discussion, we're reflecting on the moments where Jesus was presented to Pilate by the religious leaders and ending with the part where he asked Jesus the question, what is truth? So today, I'm Jason Scott Montoya, author and creator, sharing stories and systems to live better and work smarter. Today, I'm joined by Chi-Chi, Len, and Jonathan. Chi-Chi, say hello.
Hey everyone, hello.
Chi-Chi Okezzi is a network, trilingual cultural expert, author, consultant, speaker, and founder of Simple Networking. Len Wickberg. Len, say hello.
Hello.
Len Wickberg is an author, strategic mind, multimedia designer for the Child Care Education Institute, a former employee of Noodlehead Marketing, and my cousin. And he's someone leaving this world better than when he arrived. Jonathan Stover. Jonathan, say hello.
Hello.
Jonathan is supporting shop fitters and retail designers by providing extended manufacturing capabilities with cost savings as the CEO of Georgia Display. So let's jump into the passage which takes place after Jesus being betrayed, arrested, and accused. Jesus is now presented to Pilate for execution. We'll read and discuss my harmonization of the story from the different accounts of Jesus' life with quotes from the New Living Translation. Then we'll explore the story through the following questions. What can we learn about Jesus, humanity, and ourselves from this monumental moment in time? How does this event apply to our lives today? Now, for those just following along, this event takes place after Jesus' agonizing prayer in the garden, after his arrest, his betrayal by Judas, a night of scheming to find a way to sentence Jesus to death by the religious leaders, the three denials of knowing Jesus by Peter, and eventually the death of Judas. So there we enter into the story. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let me know if you see the passage in front of you. Are we good to go? All right.
Mhm.
Let me zoom in a little bit here. All right. So this passage comes from Mark 15, 2 through 5, Matthew 27, 11 through 14, Luke 23, 1 through 5, and John 18, 28 through 38. While the entire religious council led Jesus to Pilate in the early morning, they did not enter the Roman governor's palace, as doing so would make them ceremonial unclean and unable to participate in the Passover. Pilate came out to them. What charge do you bring against this man? The religious leaders answered, we wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal. Pilate responded to them, then take away and judge him by your own law. Confirming Jesus' prediction that he would die, the Jewish leaders revealed why they were handing him over for Roman punishment. Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone. Pilate returned to his headquarters and summoned Jesus. Standing before the Roman governor, Pilate turned to Jesus and asked him a question. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus quipped back. Is this your own question, or did others tell you about me? Unclear as to what was going on and why Jesus' own people had brought him before the governor, Pilate sought an answer to the presented crimes. Am I a Jew? Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done? Jesus replied, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate quipped back, so you are a king? Jesus responded, you say I am a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize what I say is true. Before going out to the crowd, Pilate replied once more, what is truth? Pilate, not staying for an answer to his question, returned to the crowd and seeing no criminal offense on the matter, spoke to the religious leaders. He is not guilty of any crime. The high priests were insistent, spewing their criminal accusations against Jesus in front of the governor. Looking at Jesus, expecting an answer and receiving none, Pilate probed Jesus. Aren't you going to answer them? What about all these charges they are bringing against you? Jesus remained silent and Pilate was amazed. Pilate turned to the mob, religious leaders, and repeated his message. I find nothing wrong with this man. The insistent crowd responded, but he is causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem. Unexpectedly prompted by what was said, Pilate responded, oh, is he a Galilean? The crowd confirmed he was Galilean. Since Herod of Antipas was in charge of that area in the Jerusalem, Pilate responded to this fact by sending Jesus to Herod. So a lot there to process. There are a few things that stick out to me, but I'll just pick one to start. When Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" and Jesus quips back, "Is that your own question, or did others tell you about me?" And I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of what's unfolding with Pilate is he's very aware of and influenced by the crowd, by the people that he is in charge of, and he's also has a desire for to prevent any type of a revolution or uprising, and so he's very sensitive to that dynamic. And so it's interesting to think like that Jesus is sort of saying like, are you actually asking me this question? Is this something you're interested in, or are you only interested in it because other people are putting pressure on you to ask it? And some of the other questions kind of fall in that category. So that's kind of what sticks out to me. Jonathan, when you hear this passage, what is it that stuck out for you?
Well, for me, it was really two ideas that surfaced one was more obvious and superficial, and one that arose as I dug into the passages and started doing a little bit of research, in context to the story. So the first and most obvious one is the seemingly blatant hypocrisy and really cowardice by the Sanhedrin. This was a group of people who, if you just read the account here, they just seem like they're wholly self-serving, that there is a certain status quo that they are trying to uphold, and that they are the beneficiaries of that status quo, probably financially from a place of status and power, and that probably feels good and they want to perpetuate that. But also, these people they're cowards, right? They're wanting the Romans to do their dirty work, and it's from earlier in the passages, the accounts of the 30 pieces of silver that they gave Judas, not wanting to receive those 30 pieces of silver because they were blood money to them. The passage that we just wrote in the harmonization there, them not wanting to go into where Pilate was because it makes them ceremoniously unclean, and it's it's market to observe that. But the second thing, the more interesting thing, was this was Pilate, and who was Pilate, and why was he acting like this, right? Because reading the account in the Bible, he seems to oscillate, right? Like he's going back and forth. Is he guilty? Is he not guilty? And he does this several times. It's not a fleeting thought. It's something that he has, that's a seeming conviction in him. And even later on, he gets a message from his wife, and his wife has some of these same reservations, right?
Yeah.
And so, who was Pilate? What was causing him to act like this? And through reading some independent accounts, some non-biblical accounts of Pilate, he was a pretty ruthless individual, and he did not oscillate in other stories and independent accounts of him. There are several accounts of him being a murderous individual that was really dealt heavy-handed in the Jewish community. He was a constant antagonist to the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And so if you brought in those predispositions into this scenario, what caused him to oscillate? Because it seemed like it would be a pretty clear-cut case for him, unless that this was a some type of strategic power gain for him, right? Because maybe he knew what he wanted to do, but he was using and leveraging the conversations with the Sanhedrin to make them beg, right? Like he wanted a certain outcome, they wanted a certain outcome. He could leverage his power and situation to make them beg for the outcome that he ultimately wanted anyways. So those were really the two things that surfaced for me.
Yeah, well, one of the things that comes to mind when you say that is I imagine most of the situations and cases that came before Pilate were fairly obvious in a sense. You have someone that's a rebel upriser, they've done something wrong, and now they're brought before Pilate, right? Now he's dealing with a situation that's unique in the sense that this seemingly innocent man is being presented to me. Like it almost seems like the situation itself kind of dislodged him or unsettled him in a way that, okay, I wasn't expecting this type of scenario to unfold. I hadn't planned for this, or I haven't experienced this. So that's one thing that came to mind when you said that. But Chi-Chi, what do you think? What is it that stuck out for you, or what resonated, or what did you connect with?
I thought it was interesting when Pilate was amazed by Jesus' non-reaction,
Mm-hmm.
learning that no response is a response.
Yeah.
And he just, if I think about it, we have that advantage because we have the Bible, we've read it, we know how the story ends, how it starts, what happens, and how it ends. So we have that advantage. But I would think, like, even back then, if you're being persecuted, even if you were guilty, you would try and say something to alleviate that to try and get out of the situation. But for Jesus to be calm in that situation, I couldn't even imagine. I don't know how I would act, right?
Yeah.
All these people that are coming against you, and they're notable people. These are not, they're well respected in the community and somewhat credible. Remember, as Jonathan said, they're not going into that space because they don't want to be unclean, but yet they're persecuting someone that's innocent, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So,
Jesus placed his fate in Pilate's hands, and he didn't quite handle that in a way that we would have hoped.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what stood out, was actually Pilate's reaction of his amazement at Jesus' non-reaction. That's what stood out for me.
And it's so, like you said, it's so, if any of us were accused of something, especially if we were innocent, none of our silence and non-response would probably not be any of our response, right?
No.
We're going to want to defend ourselves. And especially if there's a real severe consequence,
penalty,
right? This is his death, right?
Yeah.
And so if any of us were going to be sentenced to death as an innocent person based on false accusations, to stay quiet would be the last thing I'd imagine would be inclined to do. So yeah, that's interesting. So Len, what about you? What do you connect with? What sticks out?
Yeah, I didn't know much about Pontius Pilate until doing this podcast with you, and with this part specifically, I really like when he's like, when he answers back, "Am I a Jew?" And it's just some of the stuff that I've seen in research, and like Jonathan was saying, he had what is it? I don't know if the word existed back then for the anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
But he was very already anti-Semitic, and that might have been how he even got that position. But just kind of throwing that in his face already.
Yeah.
And later on, how it goes into, he's saying, like, I have the power to do this or not.
Yeah.
You got to tell me something. Or like Gigi was saying, who's going to, someone's going to defend their life if they're on trial like that. So not much, but that I have to add, but that's just what stands out to me.
Well, and that's interesting you say that, because what's happening here is kind of a flipping upside down of that power dynamic. Pilate is saying, I am in charge here, but obviously, as a Christian, we're seeing that Jesus is the one that's really in charge of what's going on, and so his lack of response is almost he's not making it easy for Pilate to do his job. Put it that way. And that kind of makes him flounder. So yeah, that's interesting. So I guess to pull back, to the beginning part where just to talk about this hypocrisy and as you said, Jonathan, the cowardice, I find it so ironic that they're presenting Jesus to be executed while they're trying to stay clean for the Passover, right? So Chi-Chi, how do you relate to that, or how do you connect to that, or what does that tell you?
I thought about, and I cheated. I listened to the episode before with
yeah, that's good. Give
to
you some
get a little bit
answers.
re-story here, and so a lot resonated for me. It's kind of that that, as you mentioned, there's how do I say this? It's like polar opposites: the law and grace.
Yeah.
The law and grace, and they want to, and it's almost like have they done this before? Manipulate stories and be able to make these type of scenes where innocent people are being executed because they don't like them, and they're able to, air quotes, get away with it under the law. And of course, we know Jesus comes to switch that around and really bring grace into the picture, and that's probably something they just couldn't deal with. They're used to going by the law, and they're seeing that it just doesn't work. How can you do that and still have a conscience? I just didn't understand that at all.
Well, I guess, Len, what would you add to that? I mean, there is an aspect of that hypocrisy that is not so foreign to us. I think we do that type of compartmentalization, I think, in parts of our lives, it seems like.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of like when we were over for dinner a couple of weeks ago, we were kind of talking about, I've been reading a lot of Tozer, and this kind of fits into that same subject we were talking about, of just the super religious, then the total anti-theists, or another religion that's besides Christianity. And then you got the people that are in the middle, the ones that actually kind of, more than not, they are the ones that actually suffer the most out of these two sides that keep on battling against each other and such. And so I think we see that too. We got Pontius Pilate on one side, we got the religious leaders on the other side, we got Jesus in the middle, and he's coming to actually change all this. And it's scary to them because of the power grabs, and it's just part of our human nature, what we do to each other.
Yeah.
And all the history and what we continue to do.
Yeah. So he goes on to, he's asking them, what charge you bring against this man? We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he wasn't for a criminal. So it's like there's a little bit of a kind of a feistiness there. And Pilate essentially, I think what's so interesting is, as an authority, he's calling these religious authorities to account, and in a sense that he's holding them accountable. And he goes on to say, his authority essentially illuminates their motivation, which he says only the Romans are permitted to execute someone. Essentially, by asking them these questions, he's getting them to answer what their motive is, which is to kill Jesus. So I found that pretty fascinating. Jonathan, how do you relate to that? Often, our motivations, we can kind of hide them because we're maybe doing something we shouldn't. Or, you have kids as I do, and sometimes we have to sort of wrestle with what's really going on here that's driving this behavior. And all of a sudden in this situation, we're seeing Pilate pull that out. So what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, so I think the obvious observation about the Sanhedrin is, as I stated, that these are probably some of the most hypocritical, cowardice people that you'll ever come across in the Bible. I mean, these people, their actions are seemingly so blatant. But what if they were acting from complete conviction? What if they really thought that what they were doing was the right thing, that they had these sacraments, right, that must be withheld at all costs?
Yeah.
By doing so, they completely miss the whole entire story, right? But what if that was the case? And just like they said, we would not have brought him if there wasn't a crime that was committed here. And so maybe there was a level of conviction there, and that caused me to think, looking at this story through the lens of our current experience now. What sacrament, even talking about politically or culturally or whatever arena that you want to take a look at, what are the sacraments on both sides that the sides hold that prohibit the truth from surfacing and prohibit good, robust dialogue and solving of problems and things like that. So I just sat in that thought for a minute and tried to say, put myself in their shoes. Maybe they weren't hypocrites. Maybe these people really were acting from a place of very strong held conviction. If that's the case, what changes does that cause me to make, right? Like how should I re-examine and evaluate the premise that I work from on a daily basis, whether it be for my kids or the church or politics or whatever else? What examination needs to be done there to make sure that the tenets that I hold and the sacraments that I have are true and upright and not artificial or fabricated by my own being or influenced by people who shouldn't be influencing me?
Yeah. So how do you know, because you have strong convictions as we all do, how do you know your convictions are not in the religious vein that we're seeing here? How do you know when it is right and good and true, and when it is you're fully convicted, but it's not those things?
Well, I think I think that someone who is a believer handles, is a follower of Christ, handles it differently than maybe someone who's not a follower of Christ. So as a follower of Christ, I seek the one thing that I know is true, and that's the Bible. So I seek truth there, but I also interlace accountability as well. And so I don't ever want to operate in a silo. And that's a very dangerous place for me personally to be in. And I assume that most people to be in, if you're making decisions in a silo. I like to seek wise counsel. I like to look to see what the Bible has a clear answer for guidance for living and for problem solving, whatever the case is, whatever situation that you're trying to wrestle down. But also seek wise counsel, because I think that there's wisdom there. Specifically for people that are older than me and maybe who've gone through these journeys, I try to seek guidance from those types of people, because left to my own devices, I'll make a bad decision, and that's not anything that's new to me. I think that's the human condition.
Yeah, and I think some of what you said, it does remind me of the Apostle Paul, right? He was, or I guess at the time, Saul of Tarsus, before he was the Apostle Paul. And he was highly convicted, and he did believe he was doing the right thing. He was a zealot, an extremist, but he believed that what he was doing was for God, right? And then he met God on the road to Damascus, and everything changed. So, Len, what would you add to that dynamic of our convictions are not necessarily true, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think that comes down to this whole thing of what is truth. That's where it starts hitting what you believe in and why. Even like Jonathan said about wise counsel, who is Pilate getting his wise counsel from? Who's the religious leaders getting their wise counsel from? So that's something that kind of interests me, and I can put ideas and thoughts in there. Yeah,
and with the religious leaders, there is an implication that Annas, who I guess is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who is the head priest, so this father-in-law is essentially kind of pulling strings, even though he's not the official leader. He's the guy behind the curtains, sort of has an authority. And so, to your point, like he certainly seems to be someone that is driving a particular agenda in this situation that leads to this moment. Chi-Chi, when you think about that dynamic, what comes to mind for you?
It's interesting. It goes back to the paradigm shift, like, Jesus being there to institute grace, and that all of this religion and these strict rules it's not a form of freedom. It doesn't represent, the kingdom of God, if you will. And I think of, the whole, his 3-year ministry leading up to his crucifixion. And I have it, I'm pulling it up here, where the crowd, the insistent crowd responded, but he's causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes. Yeah. And you're thinking, so what exactly are riots? Is it healing a woman that's been sick for 12 years on a Sabbath? but he's healing her, you know.
Yeah.
So that's that paradigm shift. You know, we're used to everything needs to be done a certain way. Like if Jason, if you're going to kill somebody, make sure you don't do it on the Sabbath. And forget the whole point that thou shalt not kill, right?
Yeah.
So I think, or even when he's going to funeral procession, and you're not, you know, with culture, you're not supposed to touch the body, and he touches the body, and the person comes alive, you know, and you're just thinking, wow, you know, so are these the riots that they're talking about, you know, and missing the point of he's setting people free and healing people. That's not important. He's causing a ruckus.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah, that's interesting, because the ruckus, you know, part of it is like, almost, if you want to get more honest, they should have said, like, instead of he's causing riots, he's causing a riot inside of us. He's offending us. He's upsetting our order, right? And it's what they're losing, not necessarily what the people are benefiting from Jesus freeing those people, as you said, right?
And Jason, it's kind of too like what we were just talking about a little bit earlier, with the two sides and how they kind of fight against each other. It's also what we talked about was, it's easier when you can just have a set of rules that you got to follow, or it's easier when you make your own rules. But at least you're following something that you know. But when something new comes up and it starts messing with people's basic, the way they live their life every day and stuff, it starts
well, part of that easy, though, I think, like, or maybe this way would be to ask you, what is the easy for? Like, what is the better towards? Like, it's easier for what? It's better for what end game? Like, what is the outcome they're desiring?
For me, I don't know about them personally, but the way I see it, and for me, it would be more of, that's the easy way to do things right. Or that's the easy way to look good to others.
Okay.
You know, it can kind of be even like, where am I getting my fame from?
Okay.
Who am I appealing to?
And what does fame give us? What does fame do for us?
That makes us feel special.
Okay.
Filled up pride and it can lead us down a bad road, and I think that's a lot of what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
Where we're become.
I mean, another dynamic, I guess, that comes to mind in thinking of that is if I can jump 2 times and it's easy for me, then if I expect other people to jump 2 times, like, I know I can pass that bar, but I know most people can't do that thing. And so now all of a sudden I've separated myself from them, but it's based on like my betterness or my self-righteousness. And so it almost seems like those rules they're shaping they're shaping them based on the things that they're able to do that they know the other people can't do, so that they can then be better than them. Does that make sense? Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. So I guess after that part, then, you know, they're accusing Jesus of these things, and Pilate's kind of confused, like, what's going on here? Like, I'd imagine the disconnect would partially also be that he's looking at Jesus, he's looking at all of these accusations, like you mentioned, Chi-Chi, the riots and stuff. Like, this doesn't seem like a guy that's inciting riots, you know? The Barabbas guy seems like the guy that would be doing that, but there's a disconnect there, right? So it seems like there's an intuition that he kind of sees that something's going on, but he goes, as Len mentioned earlier, am I a Jew? Your people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done? And so he's essentially asking Jesus the answer to that. Jonathan, what do you make of that when you think about it?
Well, I think that I think that you would get 2 different answers, like what was actually going on. Like, if you ask the Sanhedrin, they're going to give you an answer like, this guy bad, riots, brimstone, the world is ending. That's the answer that you're going to get from them. if you went and polled and asked that same question to people that Jesus was actually interacting with, you probably get a much different response. To Chi-Chi's point, you're going to hear about healing, you're going to hear about grace, you're going to hear about love, and that's what's actually going on. And so I just can't help but think, like, this is just the way my brain works. I always try to take what we're dealing with, like whatever the subject matter is, and pull that forward. And how can I apply it? Like, how do I look at my current situation through that lens? And I think that if you just listen to whoever the talking head is at the time, telling you an interpretation or version of what's going on, you're likely missing what's actually going on. And I think that this is a good case study for that, because if you went and asked any of the people that Jesus healed, which, apparently was in the middle of some kind of riot, it probably would have had a different, elicited a different response. And I think that that's noteworthy that, it's someone's story is a version of what actually happened. Now, how close of a version that is to what actually happened is left to interpretation. But that's what ends up happening.
Interesting. So when Jesus, he kind of takes a indirect path in some of these questions and responds in a seemingly irrelevant way, right, to what we think's going on. But to your point, he's actually trying to address what's really going on. And so he says, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. So Chi-Chi, he's saying, what is he saying there? If it were, he's saying if it were my followers, they would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders, but my kingdom is not of this world. So there's something that seems to be upside down here. What's he telling us?
It's interesting because you can only imagine what they're thinking. Like, what other kingdom is there, right?
Yeah, like at the time, they're not thinking the way that we're thinking.
Right?
Yeah.
This is where the
so here's another dimension of whoa.
Yeah.
And so he says he has a kingdom, so he is a king, but it's just he's not a king here. What's going on? So that was intriguing to me, and I can't help but think, because I've been binge watching, please don't judge. So I'm like, man, if this was Back to the Future, what if it was Solomon instead of Pilate?
Yeah.
What type of questions would he ask?
Yeah.
I'd be so intrigued. I think Solomon, with all his wisdom, would definitely expose the treachery that was going on with his accusers. But to your point, it gets deeper. Like, I can only imagine, what kingdom are you talking about? And he could only answer that question if you were following him, right? If there was an Instagram and you were constantly following and on his every move and watching his YouTube videos of all his healings, right? Where he talks about this kingdom, right? This earthly, this heavenly kingdom. So I think, to your point, Jason, it gets a lot deeper. Like, it's more complex, and he's still, to me, even in this moment, he's still ministering, which I think is phenomenal. He's still talking about the kingdom of heaven. He's still administering grace and still saying who he is as, he's being led to this crucifixion, which is fascinating.
Yeah. And well, and because it's interesting because, or for a few different reasons, but one of which is, I'd have to guess that this caused Pilate to pause, to at least consider it, because the Romans believed in the pantheon of gods, and they believed that these gods came to earth and interacted with people. So it wasn't entirely foreign to them that that's a possibility.
Okay.
So in that kind of mindset, I'm thinking, okay, this guy's something that I'm not. This is something different. He says from another kingdom. I almost wonder if it's caught between, is this guy crazy or is there something here? What do you think, Jonathan? Earthly kingdom versus heavenly.
I think that's a really interesting point to look at it through that perspective, because, man, this is such an interesting case study, like what's going on in Pilate's mind here, because he has both simultaneously competing interests and aligning interests with the, and it's different. It's very interesting to see him navigate that. But yeah, I mean, I really don't. I mean, looking at it from the premise of what the Romans believed, because they did believe that. They believed that there was gods and they came down, and was Jesus one of these people? And so the last position that I would want to be in, as Pilate, executing this
especially
guy
like you mentioned the letter from his wife that comes later, like that's another
Correct.
omen type of a thing, like it's superstitious type of a thing.
Correct. And that's just interesting because I thought about that, and the first thing that I thought about was like, oh man, that's the Holy Spirit coming. But all this happened before Pentecost, right? And so it's just interesting to see, is this the Lord working here? Is this God like moving and trying to and compete there, or is it really just a superficial, self-serving kind of thing, this exercise that Pilate's going through? And so I don't know. I think that's a really interesting perspective. Putting himself in the current reality of the Roman of that day, because that's really what they believed in. So he could have construed Jesus to be one of these gods, because at that point Pilate had to have known that Jesus was a man that did miracles. He might have known, because to Chi-Chi's point, there was no like live streams, right? He wasn't like live streaming this to Facebook and everywhere else. There was a disconnect in the continuity of information. So you don't know how much information Pilate had, how recent it was. He's getting told versions of what's going on by whoever his counsel is. So those bits and pieces, he did a miracle here, he did a miracle here. Maybe he is one of these gods that we.
Well, and the other thing that comes to mind is for Pilate, you talked about the competing agendas that he's trying to reconcile. And, to him, for the Romans and for Pilate, Caesar was God. There was no distinction between the gods and Caesar. He was just one of the gods. And so, what was that?
A deity.
Yeah. So that's part of, like, his God is Caesar, so his mission is to follow Caesar's direction. And part of that is to fight back any insurrection, right? So he's got that issue, and I think that's interesting because I think it all kind of hinges where it hits at the what is truth. His agendas, his competing forces. I think if we're actually and fully committed to truth, that would peel away those other agendas, because we would have to let them go in order to embrace truth. But if we're not committed to truth in something else, whether it's power or some other thing that we're desiring, then that truth pursuit is going to illuminate what our true motivation is, which I think is what's happening with the religious leaders at the same time as Pilate, right? So, Len, what would you add to that, or how would you kind of work through those things?
My kingdom come. My kingdom is not on the earth. We're still talking about the kingdom part?
Yeah. Just this idea that the truth has a way of filtering what's going on, what all these competing forces. Truth is something that sifts that out. And even, another dynamic is that's interesting. Jesus says that my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom, and goes on. And Pilate misses, it seems like he misses everything he said. He's like, so you're a king. It's like he's not even hearing him. I don't know. What do you think, Chi-Chi? That seemed to make you laugh.
It's kind of goes back to what Jonathan says. I feel like Pilate is trying to relate with Jesus as a Roman. Like, this is how we do it in our society. This is how we, handle things. And now you're saying you're a king. Well, I know what a king looks like, or I know what a king has authority. A king can decree this. A king can, have all these people come and save him. Why is it that you look roughed up, right? Mm-hmm. You're tied up, you look weak, but you say you're a king, you know?
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, it's funny. Len, what would you say about that? Just in sense of, I think Jesus is kind of going, well, what is a king, right? What does it mean to be a king? What does a king look like? What does a king do?
Yeah, and I think too, this goes along to what, a little bit further down. I don't know if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
To the actual, when Pilate says, what is truth?
Yeah.
And it's like, what is a king? Well, a king is someone who's trustworthy, faithful, someone who you can trust their word. What they're going to do is what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was kind of looking over this different scripture as well, just kind of studying the subject of truth, I came across an interesting one in the beginning of John 1. It was verse 14, and it says, so the word became human and made his home among us. He was full of grace and truth, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. And there's little footnotes for that verse. And in the footnotes, it was saying that, like, in the original manuscripts and in earlier versions of the Bible, like New King James and King James, they actually have, instead of grace, it's full of unfailing love. And instead of truth, it was faithfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So that got me kind of like thinking more about how are we defining truth?
Mm-hmm.
And then putting that faithfulness in there, all the promises that God gives us, all the promises that Jesus gave us, if what he was saying wasn't true, then what's the point of it all? If he's the one that is really the faithful one, because we mess up all the time.
Yeah.
And we are ones that are not faithful.
Yeah.
We're not faithful to him. We're not faithful to others. And a lot of times we're not even faithful to ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that question of, like, what is truth that Pilate asks, I see it even more as, like, I don't think he actually was asking it this way, but it makes me, because the way when I do writing and stuff, when I'm reading the Bible and stuff, I try to reflect on what's happening, and I'm going to ask myself that truth. So I'm asking myself, what is truth?
Yeah.
And the Spirit has shown me a lot of things through the years of doing that self-reflection. And I think Pilate doesn't understand what truth is, not just, oh, what is truth? Whatever. Your own truth is your own truth. But more of, like, what is truth? Because I have been doing things trying to please Rome. I've been doing things trying to please the Jews. Everything I do, I think I'm going to do a good job of it, but it kind of backfires in my face. And I learned a lot of this stuff. There's an really interesting video I just happened to come across last night of this guy, the 10-minute Bible hour. Have you guys heard of that?
Mm-mm.
It was a couple of years ago, and he did a really big video on who was Pilate.
Mm.
And he goes into a lot of this stuff, and a lot of stuff that I was reading online and trying to do my own research. He goes really into a lot of depth and a lot of what is just speculation and stuff as well. But I think that's something that might be behind Pilate as well, is that so many times he thinks he's doing the right thing, it fails, and he just feels like he's a mess up, or he feels like he's a failure, or he feels like he's in danger for his life.
Yeah.
And so I think coming down to that is, like, asking ourselves, what is truth, is a really good self-revealing question to ourselves as well.
Yeah. And where do we stand with wanting that or not wanting it? I think what's, right before Pilate asks that, Jesus says, he says about the kingdom, my kingdom is not of this world, but he says, I came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. Mm-hmm. And so, I
was just saying, and if you put in that, like, what I say is faithful, like what I was saying earlier, what I say is going to happen. I am faithful.
Yeah.
What I say is going to come true. It really changes the dynamic of it.
Yeah. And part of, I guess, how I read that is
like a king. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's almost like it's not just what is true, like the sky is blue kind of truth. It's like, this is the most important truth that I'm telling.
Yeah. And there's authority behind it, like we were saying earlier.
Yeah, the source.
You're a king, and he's like, yeah, this is not my kingdom. And it's like Chichi was saying, well, I know what a king looks like, and you don't look like him. He has authority and stuff. But this faithfulness that he has for us that changes the whole thing of a relationship with the Father is, I don't know, it just really stands out to me a lot. And I don't even fully comprehend it. I'm still digging into it now because of this conversation.
I think Len
Go ahead,
hit a
Chichi.
good point. I don't know if you guys caught it, or maybe you did. When Len mentioned the relationship with the Father, it seemed like these religious leaders had more relationship with the law than with the Father. I think that was a good perspective, Len.
The source of the truth. Yeah. And I guess the other thing that really kind of sticks out is all who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. And what that tells me is like Jesus is a litmus test for us in the sense that if we are truly committed to truth, we should be listening to what Jesus is saying based on the foundation that he is telling the truth, right? Which goes, what is truth, right? So it's like this, is he saying it? If he is, then he's that litmus test that we're either are or are not. So then Pilate goes on, he says, the thing that's interesting, he doesn't even stick around for an answer. He asks the question and walks away. What's going on there, Jonathan?
So the first time I read this, I thought, okay, well, the first thing that, Pilate, as soon as Pilate found out that he was a king or professed to be a king, that instantly drew Pilate's attention, right? Because you mentioned earlier, Jason, that one of Pilate's jobs as the governor there, but he was also the prefect, right? So he was in charge of administering law and things like that, was to squash insurrection. And the Romans did not view Jesus as a king. So instantly he's like, oh, I got what I need. He's professing to be king. And then Jesus, talks about being the truth. And so like I first thought like, oh, well, maybe there was like a pause. Maybe I can't imagine that a person, even like in that day, would walk up to Jesus and not know that something was different about him, right? Like I have a hard time reconciling that. You have, like through an interaction with Jesus, whether you believe in him or not, you're not going to walk away like the same. I don't see how that could happen. And so through this interaction, maybe, Pilate says, okay, well, he's a king. I got to do something about it. But then he goes on to talk about truth, and Pilate's like, man, maybe there is something about this. What is true? But then you could also read it the other way, where he just totally dismisses it. What is true? And then walks out of the room, not waiting for an answer. So I think him walking out of the room kind of is testament to his disposition on the subject. I think that he discredited it with being true because he didn't care enough to wait around for an answer.
Yeah. Although at the same time, I wonder if there is an aspect that he's like Jesus. He almost feels like Jesus is playing games with him, like because I do get a sense like when he goes back out, they're all spewing their accusations, and I think he's almost like, okay, if you're gonna play this game, like I'll just throw you back out to the lions, That's a sense that I get. But he goes down, he says, aren't you going to answer them? What about you? All these charges they are bringing against you. Jesus remained silent, and Pilate was amazed.
Yeah.
So
now that part to me, when I read it, because the Bible tells us that Jesus was both fully God and fully man, right?
Yeah.
So, man, I'm putting myself in Jesus' shoes, as a human being. That's got to be intensely frustrating, right? And he might have been a little irritated, and he was showing emotion. They're like, I'm not even going to recognize that. It doesn't even deserve a response. So that was I thought about that for a little bit when I reread that, and I read it a few times, and I could really set myself in his shoes. And no, I'm not saying I'm set myself in Jesus' shoes, but as a human sharing the human condition, that would be bother me. Like I wouldn't entertain that.
Yeah. Well, what do you? What's his reason for staying silent? You think?
I honestly don't know, and I don't know. I think that it was maybe to make a point, because at that point, nothing that he could say is going to change their mind. And in the back of his mind, Jesus knew what his final disposition would be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so from the human condition, he could have been saying, let's just get it over with, right? Because he just came out of the Garden of Gethsemane, and he knew what was about to happen to him. And that human element, that human nature, I just would think that there would be something in him saying, okay, if this is what's got to happen, let's just get it over with. Let's not belabor it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, Jason, did you have that in here, the verse where he talks about, or was that in one of your other talks when he says, you wouldn't have the authority to take my life unless it was given to you? And kind of like,
yeah, that's a little bit later when he comes back to Pilate after seeing Herod. Yeah.
I do have a comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Gigi.
In regards to what Jonathan was saying, being God and human, that's a whole different dynamic as well. I would think that was when I was reading that that write-up that you gave us, I thought that's a level of self-control I know nothing about. Just absolutely. There's always that reflex, no matter how you try, you want to be calm, you're breathing in, you're breathing out, but and you know what's going to happen. But then I also think about, during Jesus's ministry, how he was always confronting these religious leaders. And even to your point, he's God and he just didn't have time. He is eternity and just didn't have time. Like, I'm just going to check you at your thoughts. Don't even worry about speaking, So I can't imagine, like, he knows what they're thinking and then what they're saying, and he's still being calm.
Yeah.
So, like I said, it's a level of self-control I know nothing about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes back to the garden, his agony and prayer in the garden was, I think a lot of that he wrestled in that moment, and that gave him what he needed in these following moments to be more composed, which perhaps is the lesson there, for us to do that wrestling, to work out those emotions, because we know that the trials and tests are coming, and when they happen, are we ready for them?
Yeah, it's his humbleness and his meekness. We don't like to use that word anymore, but I really love that word, what it used to mean. But just that power that he has, that's under control, and he knows what's happening. He knows what has to be done. And like you're saying, going back to the garden where he was in that conversation, that deep, hard conversation with the Father.
Yeah. And there is an aspect of Jesus, he's not, or even God himself, he's not extravagant in the sense that what is necessary to accomplish the goal is what he does. So he's not trying to do more than is necessary to accomplish that. He's not using more force than is necessary. Yeah.
And it's prophesied he's going to be like that as well. So that's who he is. Again, he's faithful to the promises that he said a long time ago, before even this moment, that he was going to.
Yeah. And so, now he's there is an to your kind of double-mindedness thought, Jonathan. He's listening to them, he's listening to Jesus, he's kind of earnestly going to Jesus, like, give me something to work with, and Jesus like, that's not important, something else is important, focus on this. And he's just focused on his agenda, right? And so we all are. That's a good point. Like, just how distracted are we in our work and our relationships and life? And we're completely missing the most important part of all of it, right? So then he goes on to say, I find nothing wrong with this man. And he is defending Jesus. But the crowd, like like you mentioned earlier, Chi-Chi, he's causing riots. He's teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem. It's interesting because when you said that, it reminded me, I think it was Martin Luther King, maybe the Birmingham jail letter, but he kind of addressed, there was a lot of accusations about some of the protests they were doing, that they were causing these riots, and these particular things he was doing were peaceful. And in fact, the violence was coming at them. It wasn't them instigating it. And so there's an aspect of this that just, it seems to stick out. But it comes from the crowd. Like that's what's interesting, is the crowd is saying that he's causing the riots. Like, but isn't the crowd the riot? Isn't the crowd causing the riot because they are the crowd? I don't know what's going on there. Do you think, Chi-Chi?
It's interesting because it shows that they have an ulterior motive, right? Mm-hmm. They're getting violent with someone who clearly is not violent at all. As a matter of fact, very, very calm and passive. And yeah, so it goes back to this hypocrisy, like Len and Jonathan were saying before. You're like, where? And I can only imagine what Pilate was thinking. Like, this is out of control. And as we're reading the message or the section, he just wants to be done with it. Oh, you said he's from Galilee? Oh, well, then he needs to go to Herod. Like, just again, like, just there we go.
But it's so interesting because it's almost like he got a miracle. Like, right? I can send him over to him.
That's his time making that decision. That's for sure.
Right.
Yeah. So, what do you think of that escape? I guess.
Yeah, it was an escape route for sure.
Yeah. But how often is that us? Like, instead of dealing with the truth or this really difficult situation, we find a way out like this, or at least one that we perceive to be, because obviously Herod sends him back. But what do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I mean, I think, again, that's the human condition. I think that's what we're going to default to, right? I mean, we're, absent of any conviction, like really strong health conviction or other compass, we're going to default to the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And if we can postpone, delegate, or put off anything that hurts or causes pain or friction, I think that, absent of strong conviction or a different compass, I think that's what we're going to gravitate towards. I think, again, that's just part of the human condition, and it's a sad state because, I mean, again, I always try to look at things through the lens of our current condition and my current condition and situations, and even looking back over my life, just thinking about, man, if I had dealt with that, or if I had handled this differently, if I dealt with this head on instead of trying to go around it or postponing or delaying, the outcome would have been different, probably better. And so, I can wholeheartedly relate.
Yeah.
And isn't it funny, Jonathan, how we, especially as guys, we think we're strong if we can handle this stuff on our own, if we can keep it secret, or if we can, just handle on our own. But if once we do confess that, not only to God but to other believers and such, there's such growth in that. And we think, and there's such strength in that, but we think the strength is all in doing it ourselves and becoming better ourselves, doing it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
There's strength and freedom with those types of approaches, because once, what's the Bible says, what's in darkness comes to light. And whether you deal with it when it happens or whether you deal with it later, it's going to get dealt with eventually. It's just how much collateral damage do you collect along the way. That path can be short, that path can be long. It's really up to you. But I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is, I think we have a tendency to think we're strong, a certain level of strength that we have, but then the pressure is bigger and stronger and larger than perhaps we've experienced before. We realized how not strong we are.
Yeah. Or tired of dealing with the same thing over and over. So if there is an escape route, just take it.
Yeah.
We fail over and over in the same thing we struggle with.
Yeah. Chi-Chi, what would you say about that idea of strength and freedom and how that?
It's true. You know, you have an image of what you think you should be or what people want you to be, right? And then when you feel like and could be, like my dad said, it could be psychosomatic, you know, it's just, you know, when you realize, oh, I didn't meet that mark, or, you know, I'm not up to par. I'm trying to find a way to supplement for that. I'm trying to, you know, find a way to, you know, create this facade, if you will, you know, to look like I'm strong, because if they find out this is the way I really am, they may not like me, they may not trust me, or I might lose, you know, friends and things of that nature. So yeah, it's definitely an inner struggle, to say the least. But to everyone's point, you know, having that counsel or that support system where there's no judgment and there's that grace we talk about again. I can only imagine with these religious leaders, there's no room for, you have to be perfect, right? You have to follow the laws, you have to do this. And if you don't, you either confess and you're knocked out, or you're hiding and trying to, you know, make up for something. So I see that struggle as well, because, you know, we talked about earlier, I can't go inside because I have to be clean for Passover. And you're like, like, it's just, that's what you got out of this? Like, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Chi-Chi, how do you experience that in the networking world?
So I'm an introvert. So I'm like the low of the networkers.
And you have a networking company.
And so for me, Len, it's like, I got to get out there. I got to put my best face on. I'm tired. I don't want to deal with people, but I'm going to smile. I'm going to shake hands. I'm going to, you know, do all this stuff. And I get weary. I get really weary. So, and there are times where I'm just like, you know, I will just go in the corner and just woosah, you know, even with a big room of people, which, you know, this is pre-pandemic, you know, and to your point, there is a lot of pressure, but I have to kind of give myself some grace, like, okay, you know, and that's what I'll do. I'll look at these events, you know, see how many people are going to be there, and, you know, what type of programming it is. And if it seems like it might be overwhelming, I just won't go.
Yeah. So one other thought that kind of came to mind that we hadn't really talked about was the idea that this is contextualized within Passover. And Passover was, you know, that the last of the 10 plagues, and the angel of death came and took the firstborn for those who didn't have the blood of the lamb on their doorposts, and essentially that's representing God liberating the Israels from the oppressive Egyptians and Pharaoh. Do you all have any, you know, what direct connections do you see between the situation with Pilate and the Pharaoh situation with Moses and there? Jonathan, any thoughts that stick out for you?
I haven't thought about that particular dynamic, but as far as Pilate and his shuffling of Jesus off to Herod at the end, I think understanding what was currently going on, it was Passover, but also Pilate was in charge of governing not only the Romans, but Jews to some extent as well. And so by him shuffling, I mean, it ended up turning out differently because he had to make a call in the end, but him shuffling Jesus off of Herod was politically expedient for him as well, because that way he still maintained whatever level of rapport that he had with the Jews at the time. Because, man, in his mind, like, worst case scenario is I've got to execute this guy, this Jew, in the middle of Passover. It's going to be catastrophic, right? Like, that's what in the back of his mind. But I mean, Passover did play a lot into this. Yeah. But I think, Pilate at the end, I think that, he was acting, in my opinion, in the most self-serving way possible. And that's, and that had a direct relation to who he was dealing with, how all this was going to play out politically for him.
Yeah. Because that makes me think in terms of the Passover, like, and the importance of what's happening right now is that, God brought Israel out of Egypt. He delivered them. out from Pharaoh, and they just got themselves suppressed right over again, and now they're under the thumb of Rome. Right? And so it's like, all right, we're back to where we started. But that's where Jesus is I think what he's trying to say is like the actual the way we solve this problem is in it's in another realm, it's in another dimension, it's in the heavenly, it's in the soul. And so for us to deal with this dynamic, we have to go to the heart of the matter, and that's what I'm here to do. So it's kind of an interesting thing that just occurred to me.
That's a good point.
So what are your final thoughts? Len, you want to start us off? Like, what's your takeaway? How do we apply this to our life? Is it relevant?
Yeah, and I think what you were just talking about, Passover, and what happened when the Hebrews were taken out of Egypt and such. You know, there's a lot of political stuff there, both sides again, and even since then, when they were freed to when Jesus was going through this trial, there was times when, you know, they forgot God again.
Mm-hmm.
And he even warned them, like, if you forget me, you're gonna turn away. If you turn away, if you don't teach my word and such, and my truth from generation to generation, you're gonna forget me in 3 generations. And that happened over and over. And that's where, you know, they got exiled to Babylon and all that other stuff as well. And like I was mentioning earlier, I've been reading Tozer and Spurgeon and stuff, and I was saying this too a couple of weeks. It's just funny how we rinse and repeat history, and how they were talking back then of how bad everything is and how bad culture was, and can't wait till Jesus returns. And
he's coming next week.
And then here again in this culture, in this day and age, everything that's going on, and we kind of measure it like, oh, this is the worst humanity has ever had it. And I think that's kind of a prideful statement to say that this is the worst it's ever been. And I think we got to take a time to look back, and personally for me, like, just pour back my time into Jesus himself and such. He is the faithful one, kind of like I was going off earlier. The other word that they use for the truth in that scripture is faithfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And through it all, through all of history, he's been faithful. And so are we concerned? What are we really concerned about? Pleasing him and honoring him, glorifying him, loving others, or proving our points and fighting with each other and hurting each other and thinking this is the worst time ever? I don't
yeah.
know. It's just
what
I'm going through right now.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like the integration of that with it's very political in its application or in its implication. But I mean, what would you say to someone who's like, a lot of people would look at, you know, the world, the chaos of the world right now and say, well, we've got to get we've got to solve this politically. Like, how would you respond to that, the type of person, if they came to you and said, you know, we need better leaders, we need to do this or that politically, we need to roll out this law, we need to get this person elected? How would you respond to those?
Well, I'm wondering why they'd be coming to me asking.
But let's say they think that is the answer. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's where the life you live as a follower of Christ comes in. That's where, yeah, that's hard. I don't know exactly what I would say. I would say probably my thoughts and positions on things, but, you know, people have probably tried that before. Again, It's just a repeating of history. Nothing new is under the sun. And
so what is really that cycle? What's the meaning of us going through that cycle over and over then?
Well, that's life. And that's what's the word, the phrase of when things get worse and worse and worse, as humans are getting worse and worse and worse. What is that?
Like spiraling out of control or something?
Yeah, there's a specific
or descending.
word. like thought and theology, I think, even behind it all. But
decaying.
It's just, you gotta. I'm just so thankful that Jesus brought me to Himself, into a relationship with Him and saved me. So and I can do what I can to love others, love Him, and share His gospel.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's kind of like sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, that's kind of like going back to the truth thing. What is truth? We have all these truths out there. We have all these religions, all these plans for success. But we can't take it with us. We can't do anything with it when we're out of here. So what are we really doing with the message of Jesus? And are we trying to twist it like many have done to their own gain, or?
Yeah, because what sticks out for me when you say that is we kind of want it both ways. We want the benefits of Jesus, but we also want to use Jesus in this world we can get benefits in this side of heaven.
Yeah, we watched the latest episode of Chosen the other day, me and Elizabeth, and afterwards there's some, I know it's produced by like Latter-day Saints, or part of what's the big thing that's pushing it, but the director, he's actually an evangelist, born again Christian. And so I was just trying to get more details. I was just interested more behind the things. There's some things that in the Chosen that I can see that's like more of a Latter-day Saints influence sometimes, but then I'm also like, am I just being critical? So I was trying to look up this stuff just to find out more about it. And one of the guys that's involved in the show, he must work for the VidAngel or Angel Studios, what it's called now, but he mentioned he's a Mormon, but they don't like to be called Mormons anymore. So that's what I'm trying to say, Latter-day Saints. But it's interesting how their response as well to the Chosen, people that have been emailing him that are Latter-day Saints, saying like, how could you let an evangelical do this? So that's their truth, and then we have our truth, and they're saying like, oh, Christians hate us. Why would you let them do this? Christians are gonna distort the scriptures. How can you let them do this? And he had some pretty interesting things to say about it, but it made me think like, man, I don't hate Latter-day Saints. But see, we get these distortions of truth as well. And I was reading a lot in the Bible last week about in Peter and in John, 1 John and such, that he was writing about the antichrists that are going to be coming into the world. And Jesus says it too in Revelation and in the Gospels. And it's not just the antichrist, there's antichrists that come that say, oh yeah, we believe in Jesus. And then they'll pull you in and they believe in something else. So it can come down to that too. It's like, the Bible says, do not associate with them, don't encourage them. But then are they really followers? Because there's the other verse where Jesus is confronted, well, not confronted, but has his disciples come up to him and they're like, hey, there's these people that are casting out demons and healing people in your name, but they're not part of our group. So we told them to stop. So it's like, well, what do I do about that verse too? And I'm sure there's a lot more context behind that as well. But it just gets me thinking more of others and that are let's say they know Jesus and they know the truth, but they practice other things than what I believe is the truth from the Bible and for what God's revealed to me. So it's, I don't know, it's
complex. Yeah. Jonathan, what would you add to that, and what final thoughts would you have for our discussion today?
Well, final thoughts, just reading back through the story, and even like around Easter, even, you forget the gravity of what happened and the carnality and just how bloody this whole entire situation was. And it just brings a refreshed sense, I guess, of gratitude and I don't know if respect is the right word, but just an awareness of what sacrifice actually took place then, right? And it's humbling. It's overwhelming if you really think about it, like what actually transpired back then, and the love that Jesus had to have. You can't even fathom that type of love to endure something like this. It's just always a good. It keeps you grounded. Is what it does.
Yeah, because
also. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So the second part to it was, Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom, or my followers do not fight me." And then goes on to say, "But my kingdom is not of this world." And so, like, I think that if we as a society looked for our answers, not earthly answers, but kingdom answers, heavenly answers, I think that we would find ourselves in a much different situation. Instead of seeking answers based on logic and academics, we seek answers that are based in love and truth, which are not of this world. So if we can look at things through a different paradigm, I think that it would change everything. It's such a powerful statement. My kingdom is not of this world. So if the kingdom is not of this world, why are we seeking answers that are of this world? And so it just changes the way that you think and approach not only problem solving but questions, but just life in general. It's just a marvel.
Yeah, and it's the way in which Jesus saw everyone, and his love for them. Like, we can even be critical of Pilate and the religious leaders who can be more villainous in this story than not, but at the same time, he loved them too, just as much. And so he saw them in a way that even can be hard for us to see because we're not in those positions. But however he was seeing things, he loved them and loved and saw through that love. And there's something for us to dive into and to ask for and to develop that vision, because it's difficult to not there's a tension there of the person and what they're doing and their sin or their idolization and the consequences of that, and the person that God created, who's made in his image, who is to be honored.
And when I'm not loving others, I'm not loving God.
Yeah. Unto the least of these you do unto me. So Chi-Chi, what would be your final thoughts and words of wisdom for us?
This has been a great talk. I really enjoyed it. And for me, I always think of remembrance, the whole the process. And I was hearing someone say, when we wear a cross, we see that as a symbol of grace. It's Jesus. And during that time, it was, capital punishment. It wasn't something, as Jonathan said, extremely bloody. It's very violent. It's death, but we've taken that paradigm shift and turned it into something else, and then also with the Last Supper, with the communion, going back to what Len said, the relationship piece was totally gone. You now that I'm going to go through this, we're connected. You don't have to go through someone. We can have this personal relationship, and you don't have to be bound by all these rules and laws and regulations. That freedom Jonathan was talking about. And I always think of even because I'm a history buff, and when they talk about the leaving the Exodus, going through the Red Sea, it actually parted, and they were saying that it might have, the walls of the water could have been like 1,000 feet high, and I'm thinking, even if it was 3 feet high, I still think that's a miracle within itself, right? But, to Len's point, once they got over, they were complaining, like they quickly forgot, like, how do you miss? And then that's just me being judgmental. Like, if I was there, I would never complain, right? So I think it just goes back to that remembrance. We have to remember, and to Jonathan's point, to be grateful, to be humble. This is not just, and Len said it too, this stuff was prophesied centuries and centuries ago and was fully carried out. So this is not by chance, you know?
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you all for participating in it.
Absolutely. It was great. It was great.
All right. Awesome.